Hello and welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thiel, and this week we continue our weekly Torah studying in the book of Numbers, chapter 13 to 15. We have from the prophets Joshua, chapter 2, and from the New Testament, we have Hebrews, chapter 3, verses 7 through 19. Now, our Torah passage and our prophets passage are kind of parallel to each other. They tell similar stories. There are differences between the two, and actually major differences, and they will help us to kind of understand the theme of this week's study as we look at the book of Hebrews. And so we will start by looking at Numbers chapter 13 and seeing that it starts off with Moses being told by God that he could go ahead and send some men on his behalf to go investigate the land of Canaan. And what we have in Joshua is a similar situation where Joshua sends in two spies to scout out the land. Obviously, the difference is you have about 40 years between these two events, and then in who gets sent out and the amount of people that go out and who is sending them out, because in our Torah portion we have Moses is the one who's sending the people out, and obviously in Joshua we have Joshua doing that because Moses is dead at that point. Now, before we get into the story and the narratives and like kind of comparing the information and taking a look at it, what I want to do is give us some grounding perspective as far as where they are in this journey. And I haven't done this in a while, so I know this is a little small, but just zoomed out for you to see for a moment the kind of general area. You have Egypt there on the west side or on the left side of the map. You have that Arabian Peninsula, which is in the middle. And then to the right, you have, and to the north, you have the promised land that they're headed to. And the right, you would have, what's now Saudi Arabia. And so in this area, and by the way, this Arabian Peninsula now is controlled by Egypt. And so you have Mount Sinai there. Of course, that's where they've been staying for the last year as they've entered into now their second year of being out of Egypt. They start to head up north to go into the land that God has promised them. They've got all their laws. They've got everything they need to with the tabernacle, their system of sacrifices, everything set up. So now it's time to head out. Now we can zoom in a little bit here just to see that route. There are two options that they have here as being the possibilities how they get to the east side of the Arabian Peninsula. So that's where you have the green and the red. But once they get to this point here is where they travel up the coast, and then they head up into the promised land and into the area that is known as Kadesh Barnea. That's where the scriptures tell us that they stop and they camp, and that's where Moses then sends out these spies. Now, what we also have is a map of how the spies took their route up into the promised land to scout this land. And I do say spies because they're typically understanding the situation that way, but the reality is they are scouts, not spies. What's the difference? We'll look at that in a minute. Again, I know that's really far out, but that's just kind of a general idea. You can see the routes that are there. We'll zoom in a little closer so that you can see it better with your own eyes. And so what we have here is just this indication that they travel north from this place, Kadesh Barnea. They stop at Hormah and Beersheba, and then they go up into Hebron. The scripture tells us Hebron is one of the places they stop before they go up through Jerusalem, which is where the Jebusites are. You see Shechem, and then you have Beth Shan, and they go all the way north until they reach their final destination in the northern part of the land. It's at Lebo Hamath before they head back. Now, what we have in the narrative is important to understand and really understand the language and the sense and the tone of what's being told to us, so we can really then get why they failed, why this was a failure. This wasn't just a moment of disbelief or disobedience or a lack of faith. There's more to this story than just that. It's definitely part of that, or part of the story is that there's a lack of faith, disobedience, a lack of trust in God. But there's also a driving force or principle or reason as to why they doubt, why they have fear, or why they don't want to obey. And so, let's get into it. So what we have here, and just from the very beginning, you can see on the screen, you have the title of the scripture portion, of the Torah portion that comes from Numbers. And if you're not familiar with the podcast, that's just how the Jewish people divide their portions for reading, and it's just titled based on the first few significant words of each passage. And so for this passage, we have the Hebrew word shelach, which is the name that's given for the passage, and just translates to send for yourself. So they're looking at verse 1, Adonai, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, send some men on your behalf. That's what that Tree of Life version uses as translation. But the idea is send for yourself. And what has to be understood is that in the Hebrew, the word shalach, which is there in the name of the title there of the passage reading or the portion, is that word implies that God is saying, okay, go ahead, Moses, and send for yourself the scouts that you want to send. And it implies what's known as divine distancing. So in other words, Moses has gone to God requesting that spies would be sent into the land, or at least asking permission. Should we do this? And we've already seen through Numbers and even Leviticus and Exodus, Moses has no problem asking God whatever it is the people are asking him. If he doesn't have the answer, he's not sure, he has no problem submitting to God's authority. In fact, that's why the tabernacle is built, is so that they can have a direct relationship with God. And even though he's given his laws and commands, and sometimes you don't know what you're supposed to do in certain situations, like we saw last week with Passover and those who miss it for legitimate reasons, what do? Okay, we have a celebration a month later as a makeup date. And why am I saying that, or how can I say that with certainty? It's not just in the language, but it's also in Moses' retelling of this event. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses is back to the land, the whole people, they're back to that border, that place where they're about to go into the land. He knows that he is now not able to enter into the land. Events that we'll see play out in the book of Numbers as to why that happens, if you're not familiar. And so he's retelling the story. And so he's saying that when they left Sinai, they went to Kadesh Barnea, like we saw on the map. It says in verse 20, I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving to us. In verse 21, see, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up, take possession, as the Lord your God of your fathers has promised you. Do not be afraid or discouraged. So that's his message to them. And in verse 22, again, he's retelling the story. Now it's being recorded for everybody to have kind of an account of what actually happened. In verse 22, it says, then all of you came near to me and said, let's send men ahead of us to explore the land for us and bring us back word about the way we should go up and the cities we will enter. The idea seemed good to me, so I took 12 men from among you, one man for each tribe. They turned and went up into the hill country and to the wadi, and they spied out. And so he goes on to tell what they did as they went in and they came back. But again, in Exodus, as we saw, it starts off and there's no indication in chapter 12. Chapter 12 is just they camped there in this place. And then it says that God is telling Moses, okay, go ahead and send some men on your behalf to investigate the land. And at first reading, again, it can look like it's God's idea to send these people out there. But looking at Deuteronomy and seeing how Moses retells the story, and then also looking at the language, as I mentioned earlier, that's here in the book of Exodus, what we can understand then as a whole is that what actually happened is Moses told them, okay, now we're going to go into this land. This is the land God has promised us. And the people were the ones that came to him and said, hey, we'd like to send scouts up there. And so he went to ask God about his opinion, and where Exodus picks up is where God is answering him. And God's answer is, okay, Moses, if you want to go ahead and send people up there, I think that's a good idea. Go ahead and do that. I'm not going to stop you. And like I said, the implication is that God is kind of distancing himself from this decision. He's allowing Moses to be the one to, have that final say. And so that's really important because it tells us then that God isn't involved in the sending of the spies or the scouts into the land. He's involved in that he was asked about it. Moses went to go ask his opinion, his advice, his leadership, and God was willing to step back and say, okay, I want to see what you're going to do. If you want to do it, you can go ahead and do it. And Moses goes ahead and does it. And it's about the leadership of Israel and their desire to do so. And that's where Moses is acquiescing to their request. So it's really important to pick up because of what happens as a result of them going into these places. Now, it's important to notice that what God does is he tells them, but what you're going to do is you're going to send the heads of each tribe. So you're going to send princes. So he's not sending out spies, like I said earlier, not people that are supposed to be hidden. These are men that are known, like at least they're known in their own communities. They know who they are. And we're going to send them out and they're going to go do their thing. And they're going to be people that have authority and power in each of their tribes. And that, again, is also important. They're not just nobodies to go out there and come back. They're actually people with influence and power because they're called the chief princes of Israel. They're the heads of each tribe. And so when they go into the land and they're going in as scouts, not spies, they're going to be able to identify themselves and let people know who they are. You're going to see how that plays out as well. I just highlighted a couple of the princes that went out. From Judah, you had Caleb. And from Ephraim, you had Hoshea, who later on we see that Moses is given the name Joshua. Now he gave Hoshea, son of Nun, the name Joshua. So Hoshea, Joshua comes from the tribe of Ephraim, and then we have Caleb coming from the tribe of Judah. So as you go into the passage, you see in chapter 18, they get this mission from Moses. And Moses says to go up in there, see what the land is like, see what the people are like, see if they're strong, see if they're weak. What kind of land are they living in? Is it fertile? How's the soil? I want you to bring back the fruit of the land. And it tells us that it was the season for the first ripened grapes. And so they go ahead and they explore. As I mentioned earlier, they went to Hebron. That's an important part. That's where Abraham once went and settled. And so it's like a really significant part of their culture and their society and their history, I should say, that Hebron is one of the places they started at. And they go into the land. And so they investigate for 40 days and they come back. They give their report in verse 27. It says, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it's flowing milk and honey. And this is some of his fruit. And it tells us, I just skipped it, but it tells us that the grapes were so big, they had to put them on poles to carry the cluster back. So the fruit is huge. It's just this extremely fertile soil and land and just everything God had promised them it would be when they first were going to leave Egypt. But in verse 28, we see, except the people living in the land are powerful and the cities are fortified and very large. So they have this positive part where they're like, yeah, the promised part of the land is good. It's there, but we have a problem. There's large fortified cities and there's large powerful people. And they say, we even saw the sons of Anak there. Now, one of the more famous descendants of Anak later on is going to be the giant known as Goliath, who David defeats very famously, that a lot of people learn about in Sunday school. David got 5 stones and kills Goliath. And then later on, they kill the rest of his brothers. So there is the idea, there's truth that the sons of Anak are there. They are giants for sure. So they're big, strong people. And so they're scared of them. And so the report, it seems honest at first. They're telling them there's large fortified cities and there's large people. Even the descendants of Anak are there, meaning, again, there's giants. And then they tell them about all the other people there, including the Jebusites. And I'll say this about the Jebusites. They are one of the hardest people rid of in the land. In fact, they're the last people to be removed from Jerusalem. And it's David who has to do that. So they're able to keep the land because of where they are set up in the mountains. Very difficult. But ultimately, their report comes back as a positive and a negative, but more negative than positive. There's like all those promises and the stuff that God said are there. It's true, but we've got a lot of obstacles in front of us. And I don't know if you've been following. If you have, you should remember this. Just if not, don't, be gracious with yourself. You remember, God said originally in his plan for them conquering the land that he was going to send his angel before them, that it was kind of going to be like a hornet going in front of them, and that they were going to conquer the land slowly, progressively, that his hornet would go in front of them, the angel would go in front of them, and it would drive the people out. The terror of the Lord will come among the people and they will leave. So their language actually indicates that the people really don't even have to fight. What God's going to do is chase people out of the land, and then they're going to go and occupy the land. But he told them it's not going to happen all at once, because then the land will become useless. You need to grow as a people. They need to grow in their population, in their abilities. And so what God said he's going to do is going to move them into the land. He's going to protect them. And then when it's time, he's going to chase out the next group of people. And then they would move into that part. And then they'd grow. And then it was time, he would chase out the next group and the next group. And so really they wouldn't have to fight. It would again be God who was moving them slowly and progressively into the land over a course of time. Don't know exactly how long it would be. Just God says, when you're ready, the land will accept you and you'll go in. And so that was always kind of the plan. And so when you look at what Caleb says, it makes sense because Caleb is one of the ones who's faithful and understands what God has said and promised already about this conquest. And so he says, we should definitely go up and capture the land, for we can certainly do it. And he's probably thinking like, not only will God drive him out, but we also can do it. So he just has like this supreme confidence in their ability to do this thing. But the men then say, we cannot attack these people because they are stronger than us. And then they start to spread the report around the people. And it says they start saying that the land that they passed through will devour its residents. The people we saw are of great size. We also saw there the Nephilim, because the sons of Anak are from the Nephilim, but they're now using the phrase the Nephilim. And if you remember, those are like the mythological, large, giant creatures that were the result of the angels coming down into the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6, and the reason why God ended up flooding the earth. And so they're calling back to that. And the idea is that the sons of Anak are descendants from them, but they're just like genetically, they're bigger people, but nowhere near the size and strength of those who originally were created by the Nephilim. In fact, they're supposed to be kind of wiped out by the flood, right? I don't see how they're supposed to survive. Somehow the genetics still exist because we have this being after the flood. Sons of Anak are there. But the point is, if you look at all of this, and it's really important because you can get caught up in those details. And they said, we seem like grasshoppers in their eyes. What the text is actually telling us, especially in the Hebrew, the language, is that once Caleb starts to encourage them that they can go into land, they start exaggerating about what stands before them. And so the question is then, why are they doing that? Why are they now exaggerating the size of the enemies and the land is going to devour them? They're going to get their butts kicked. Why are they doing that? What motivates them to do that? And that's where, when I look at the story in Joshua, I kind of put two and two together and realized, oh, that's what's happening. So in Joshua chapter 2, which is our prophet's portion, very famous story again, because I don't know, Sunday school, you learn about Joshua and Jericho and the walls of Jericho. It always starts off with him sending out 2 spies into the land, and then they go and stay with a harlot or a prostitute named Rahab. And Rahab becomes later on to be known as an ancestor to David, and even mentioned in the genealogies of Jesus. And so Rahab is a really important figure. But just notice the pattern here. When Joshua sends his 2 spies, he does it secretly, and he's only choosing 2. He's not doing 12. This is kind of like his own idea, probably. It says he does it secretly. And so they go into the house of a prostitute, and there's Rahab. And I believe that was probably the smartest way to go into a land that you didn't belong to. You go into the house of a brothel or a prostitute or whoever, because you're a traveling person. That's a place where you can stay. And from there, you can plan your mission and go forward. And so that's what these 2 guys do. Because maybe, people don't think much about you, or they see you traveling, coming into their city. Instead of being suspicious, like, why are these guys coming into our land? They think, oh, they're going to be with Rahab tonight. So she's just, it's just business for her. But we also see in Joshua that the king of Jericho has his own scouts. And so what we learn is that the people of Jericho, the king of Jericho, have been keeping an eye on the children of Israel as they've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And what Rahab tells the guys that go in, the 2 spies that come in, says, okay, we know who you are. And she hid them, and she said, we know that who your God is, and we know that he's giving you the land, and the dread of all of you has fallen on all the inhabitants of the land, and we're all melting in fear before you. Why? Because they heard how God dried up the water in the Sea of Reeds and what happened when they came out of Egypt. And then she also adds in what they did in the wilderness between this point here where we are in Numbers and the end of Numbers, the beginning and going into Joshua, they heard about all these stories. And so it says their hearts melted and no spirit remained anymore in anyone because of you. Now, in Joshua's story, Rahab, as a prostitute, she knows all of this. She communicates this to the spies, and she chooses to be faithful to God. She's like, I understand your God is great. I know that he is somebody I gotta fear and worry about, and so I would like to serve him if possible. So can we make a deal where me and my family can be saved, and then you guys, I'll help you guys out, and then you can go back, and then you can deal with this thing as long as we live and survive. And those were the two that went into Jericho, and they had gotten that information. Now, I was thinking, just kind of logically, did the 12 kind of have the same approach? Maybe they broke up in twos as well. Maybe they went into different places. They traveled up north, and maybe Joshua and Caleb went to the same place in Jericho. Maybe they heard the same news. Maybe they all heard the same news. And I know it's a lot of maybes, a lot of guesses, but to me, it does make sense. And remember, this is only 40 years later when Rahab is recounting the stories of what it is they believe and heard and saw. And I think it's very possible that the people in Canaan, in the land, all those people have already heard about what God has done to the Egyptians and how he got these people out of there. That's the very first part of it. In fact, God says that's going to be the result. One of the results of how he's going to take them out of Egypt is everybody's going to know how mighty, how strong his hand is. And so what if as the scouts went up into the land, that while Joshua and Caleb came across prostitute or harlot they stayed with who had the same response as Rahab, who said, "Oh man, we know who you are. You're scary. Yeah, let's make a deal. You protect us, and then we'll be good." Okay, but what if the other 10, as they went up into the land and they were found out, because again, there were people who were watching them, and in Joshua it says that again they were spying on the children of Israel to keep an eye on them. And so if the people of Canaan had been spying on them as well, again, it's very possible. It's been over a year since they were just at Sinai. They were all camped there. So it's easy to set up a situation where you're like, okay, we got to keep an eye on these people because where are they going to go? What if then those 10 spies, as they were telling people like, oh, wait, I'm a prince of Israel. I'm a head of a tribe. Oh, me too. And they were convinced, told, bribed, hey, if you get your people to go back to Egypt, you can come back here, we'll set you up real nice. And I know that's not exactly what the text is telling us in the narrative, but when you see kind of the language and the exaggeration, and then what happens here in chapter 14 and the grumbling and the complaining, and then their punishment, I think it logically makes sense that that's what's happening. And I know, again, that's my idea. I didn't read a lot of commentaries or some suggestions about that, and a lot of the focus was on disobedience and distrust. But I have one more text I think that'll help support this conclusion, and that is a text that comes at near the end of chapter 14, when God goes to speak about the people and their response, and specifically his judgment of what they have done. And so he says in verse 33, they will suffer because of your unfaithfulness. And so he's talking about the children of the spies and this specific generation. The idea is that for the next 40 years, they're going to now wander in the desert. Everybody that's 20 years old and older are going to die in the wilderness, but their children are going to be raised up in the wilderness. And so that's what he says, they will suffer. He says, they will suffer because of your unfaithfulness until your corpses are consumed in the wilderness. And we look at the exegesis of this phrase here. It says, they will suffer because of your unfaithfulness. In the exegesis of this word, that's looking at the actual word in the Hebrew and trying to understand its breakdown, its definition, and its meaning. It's a word you can see here on the screen. That means it says zenut, and I see that it's small there. I want to make it a little bigger for you if you're watching on YouTube. And so you can see that now, hopefully a little better. And it says zenut, and the meaning of it is prostitution, sexual morality, exchanging service for valuables, unfaithfulness, the state of act of not being faithful or believing the deity. But look at that as a figurative extension of illicit sexual relations. So what is that saying? That's talking about the idea of fornicating in the context of relationship with God. And what is that? That's idolatry. And so specifically, if they went into the land and they joined with prostitutes from the land, they would have been joining in with prostitutes that belong to different gods. That's a very common way for people to serve their gods as a cult. That's what people will do. That's something that's done throughout history in the prostitution, the act of sex, and the selling of the body. So if they went ahead and did that, and then in that exchange, they then learned that they could exchange something for their own safety or for their own wealth or for their own gain, which we just looked at the definition, that unfaithfulness. They are looking at the God that they have and what he's done for them. And remember, this generation specifically has always struggled to let go of the gods of Egypt. They've always struggled to do that. No matter how much this Lord God of Yahweh that brought them out, the I am who I am, no matter how much he did for them, no matter how much he showed them and provided for them, they continue to complain, they continue to grumble against him, and they continue to say things like, wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? So going back to the beginning of chapter 14, it says, only we had died in Egypt. They were grumbling. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back? It says, let us choose a leader. And so the idea there was that they were about to stone Moses and the other leadership so that they kill them and then go back to Egypt. This is how far they're taking things. And why would you go back to Egypt? What's the point of that? You saw their armies destroyed. You know what they did to you there. I really think, and I think, again, the exegesis of the word unfaithfulness and just the context of what's happening here, their exaggeration, I think it really all points to they made a deal for themselves. As long as the people go back, and then we'll come back and we'll be good over here. I really think that they're making this exchange, and this whole God that's been serving them, like, forget about him. He's not as good or strong or whatever. They're still not convinced. That's definitely the case. And so this section here, verse in the middle parts of verse 9, 10, that's where Joshua and Caleb are trying to convince the people to change their minds. As we have protection, they will be prey for us. We're the predators. We shouldn't be afraid of them. They're afraid of us, which again, Rahab told the two spies that came to see her, and they probably heard this report as well. They probably heard, because they're the two faithful ones, they probably heard that positive report. That, hey, everyone here is scared of you, and they're scared of what you're going to do because they heard of what you did to Egypt. And so then that's verse 10 where they talk about stoning them, and that's when God finally interjects, and he tells Moses, how long will these people treat me contemptibly? And so he says, like, I'm going to go ahead and destroy them and make them a greater and stronger nation, or make a stronger nation from you. At that point, Moses intercedes. What's interesting here in the text, what's actually being communicated in the question, is that Moses is being invited by God to intercede. So it's not that God is like looking for someone to change his mind. He's kind of, and a lot of commentators did agree on this, he's kind of testing Moses in this sense. Like, what is Moses going to do here? Is he going to remain faithful to these people and he's going to intercede on their behalf? Or is he going to say, go ahead and judge them? Is he going to be faithful to me? What exactly is going to happen? What we see is that Moses chooses being faithful to God, but at the same time, in a way that honors God and reflects God's true nature and just reflects exactly who he is. So he's faithful to God's nature in his response. And so that test for Moses allows God to then make his decision freely, and then they move on from there. And again, it was Moses who thought this was also a good idea to send these scouts in. So I think God is also having to take a look at Moses' heart and see exactly where he's at as well. So Moses' argument is very similar to the one he's given before about God not destroying the people, that the Egyptians, everybody else is going to hear that you couldn't deal with these people, you couldn't handle them. And then he appeals to that phrase that God says when God covers Moses in the cleft of the rock with his hand. He passes over and he says, behold, behold, I am the Lord your God, and I am slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and forgiving iniquity, and that's there in verse 18. But he also says that he will not leave the guilty unpunished. So he's still going to deal with sin, and the iniquity of these fathers will be brought upon the children to the third and fourth generations. And then we see in verse 20 that God has already forgiven them. It says, I have forgiven them just as you have spoken. But he also has judgment for them. As we talked about earlier, that none of the people who saw his miracles and his signs in Egypt and in the wilderness, none of them are going to be able to see the land that he promised their forefathers. And so it says here, yet tested me these 10 times. So you can go back and count all the times that they were tested. Testing God when they were thirsty, they were begging for water, when they wanted the quail, like we saw last week, the golden calf situation. The golden calf situation really does reflect, that heart that they have of idolatry and wanting to worship their home gods. And even the lack of water and the grumbling, again, their argument was, weren't we better off in Egypt? Let's go back. And so there's always this pull back. I think the context is always telling us their relationship with their previous gods and their previous lands, even if they were slaves, more important to them than this relationship with this God in the wilderness and about to approach this promised land. And so, as we already saw, God judges the people. He says that each of their bodies of the people that are 20 or older are going to fall and die in this land. The children of the people are going to be herdsmen, so they're going to learn how to shepherd animals and lead flock, which is pointing to a sign of the kind of leadership and heart God looks for. And like Moses also did that for 40 years as well with Jethro. And obviously throughout scripture, we see this importance put on being a good shepherd and how shepherds take care of the sheep and comparing leadership to that. And that's kind of a practical way to look at leadership as caring for animals. But that's what they're going to be. That's what they're going to become, because that's God's preparation plan for them to be able to enter into the land. And so we see that for 40 years, a number of 40 days, which they explored the land. So remember I said earlier, they explored the land for 40 days. And so in those 40 days, each day there was a sin, there was a problem. And so linked to that is their judgment of having to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for every day. And so God says he's going to do that kind of thing because they've banded against him, and he judges them. And then you see that the 10 who spread the bad report, they died of plague in God's presence. And you're going to see later on in the book of Numbers that people die of plague whenever they engage in the worship of other gods, especially through sexual sin or promiscuity or prostitution. And so I think that all of that context, the context of all of these chapters really fits in well together to help explain why these scouts came back with this negative report. It wasn't so much about their lack of faith. It's just that they didn't have faith. They didn't have belief in God. They had belief in themselves. They had belief in another God. And what I want to say here is that a lot of people talk about lack of trust, lack of faith, or you have to believe. What the scriptures tell us, I think with this story and just as together as a whole, the scriptures tell us is that a lack of faith isn't that you don't have enough faith, is that your faith is misappropriated. It's either off the target, like it's not on target, it's not on the bullseye, it's not an accurate faith because it has things about it that are just not right and just wrong, like with Peter thinking Jesus is going to be the Messiah. And so he just didn't have the faith right away. Not that he's the Messiah, but he is the Messiah, but that he was going to be the reigning king Messiah, right? Jesus said, no, I have to die first. So he didn't have that understanding. And so that's why Jesus said to him, you have this faith that's just kind of, you're missing the mark with this faith. And so you can have that where it's just like kind of lack of information, ignorance, a belief system that's in the God, but just off in its direction and the purposes that God has, a misinterpretation of the scriptures, bad teaching, whatever. You can also have lack of faith because while God gives you this information and you have it there, you choose not to believe it because you'd rather believe something else. And that's a different kind of a lack of faith. It's disobedience, but it's also a lack of faith. Because in that choice to be disobedient, you're not realizing that when God said that if you go ahead and join yourself with other gods, there's going to be judgment for that decision, you're choosing to not believe it. You're choosing to say, it's not that important. It's not going to bother me. It's not going to be an issue for me. And that right there, again, it's disobedience, but it's a lack of faith. It's a lack of trust in what God has taught you and told you to believe in about himself. And so that's where I would see the lack of faith issue being brought up here with these people. And so God then tells them that they're going to have trouble. They see the 10 guys die. And so that's a sign to them like, oh man, we shouldn't have been believing these people. Look at them. They just died of plague. And now what are we going to do? Because God has judged them. And, let's go do it. Let's go and fight it. We can do it. Moses tells them it's not going to happen. You can't go and do this on your own. They're like, oh, we're going to try anyway. And they get beat down. They get sent back. And now they realize they're not going to be able to go into the land just as God has promised. Now we're going to look at Numbers chapter 15 real quickly. I don't want to spend too much time in this chapter. But what we have here in Numbers chapter 15 is a set of laws that are given to the people. And at first I was like, oh, why are we just like repeating these laws? Like, isn't this just a repetition of stuff in Leviticus, especially Leviticus chapters 1-7? We're looking at, the retelling of this burnt offering and this type of offering and unintentional sin offerings. And why is Moses bringing this up, or why did this chapter get placed into this part of the narrative? Because you look at chapter 16, is right after this. For next week, there's going to be a rebellion. And so it feels like that is more, it's appropriate, like in terms of storytelling. So again, this is kind of is put in there as an interjection. It's like, why are we doing that? But what I learned in studying is that these laws communicate to the people that God is indeed going to be faithful to his promise that they will be able to return. And so in verse 2, it says, when you enter the land that I'm giving you, where you'll make your homes, and then he goes into what they're supposed to do in terms of presenting sacrifices. And so what Jacob Milgram says is that the people see this and they say that there's a divine reassurance, like your children will inherit the land. So even for the people that rejected the going into the land and grumbled and complained and were scared to go in, that they would hear these new set of laws and they would say, okay, God is going to let our children go in. And it's kind of like, again, it's going to be based on their faith and trust. If God is giving this teaching to them about the kind of sacrifices he wants to have given to him once they enter the land, then you take that and you say, okay, the implication is he is indeed going to bring us into the land like he said he would. And he's promising it and he's guaranteeing it. And we're seeing this set of laws as a sign of that. There's also the addition of the idea of this, of a wine offering, or I should say a drink offering. So it says you take a fourth of a hin, so it's just a unit of measurement of a wine as drink offering, and you pour that out. And so there's mentioning of drink offering a few times throughout this passage. So what's that about? Well, they've been in the wilderness. They haven't had grapes. They're not able to grow that kind of stuff. We saw them complain about that last week, how they don't have cucumbers, melons, everything they had in Egypt. So they get to the promised land. These guys bring back all this fruit. Remember, they brought back this cluster of grapes. And so even with that, God is saying, like with these set of laws, is he's saying you're going to go into the land. You're going to have those grapes that you saw. You're going to have the produce of the land. And so when that happens, we're going to update our process of bringing sacrifices. So it's going to be included a drink offering, which is just pouring out the wine at the altar. And then there's also going to be this daily bread offering, and that's a sign again of the wheat and the harvest they're going to get. And so really, when you look at chapter 15, where you're getting in the laws, especially about the sacrifices, is again just these reassurances that the good things of the land that he had promised them will still be there. So you have 40 years of wandering. Really what we're doing is we're getting rid of that generation that didn't believe. And once they're gone, we're going to enter into the land, and all the stuff that I promised you will still remain. So much so that here are the laws for you to follow once you get there. That's what we can see in the first part of chapter 15. When you get to verse 22, you have this idea about unintentional versus defiant sin. And again, we've seen that before, like what is an intentional sin, unintentional sin. And it's just like, just kind of making mistakes, not realizing that certain offering was supposed to be given or certain festivals going on. And so there is a process for forgiveness and atonement and a pleasing aroma to God. I highlighted pleasing aroma throughout the chapter. I encourage you to go back and do that as well. Remember, a pleasing aroma is a phrase that means a gift to God. And so what is a gift to God? In the New Testament, we see in Ephesians chapter 5 that part of our pleasing aroma is just the way we walk and walk in love as the Messiah walked. And so when we give off a pleasing, fragrant aroma to God, we're giving to him a gift that he loves to receive. He loves to receive gifts. Our God likes to get things. And what does he like to get? He likes to get those things that we're willing to give him with sacrifice from our lips, the thanksgiving that we give and the praise, and then the acts of kindness and love that we do for others as his son did. Again, Ephesians chapter 5, if you want context as far as reading in the scriptures about what that is. But there's also this idea in verse 30 to 31 about those who sin defiantly, whether the native or the outsider. So someone who reviles God, someone who blatantly sins. It's kind of a new category of sin here. It's called a high-handed sin. And so it's not ignorance, it's straight rebellion against God's ways. And the rebellion is to be dealt with by the person being cut off from the covenant with God. And so that means they're going to die. It literally means they're going to be cut off in that sense that they're not going to get the blessings of the covenant, but they're also going to die physically. And so there, as an example is given to us, is a man who goes out and gathering wood on the Sabbath. And it supposedly is like the first Sabbath after they refuse to go into the land. And so you have a guy who apparently in his doing this is defiantly going against God. He's purposely doing that. And they're not sure actually. So they arrest him and they bring him to Moses. And Moses says, it says here in verse 34, they kept him under arrest, not knowing what to be done with him. And in verse 35, God says the man has to die. And so in God making that judgment, he's saying this isn't an unintentional thing. Like you can see earlier in the chapter, if you want to read it, there's a process for that. There's forgiveness to be had. There's, sacrifices to be made. And God could have said, hey, remember what I said about unintentional sin? Go ahead and do that. No, he says, no, this person needs to die. And so of the two, he's doing this brazenly. He's doing it defiantly. It's just in the context we can decide that. And so they go ahead and they stone him. And so that's an example of that. And then what we're going to see in the next chapter, next week's reading in chapter 16, there's going to be a defiant rebellion against God. And there's going to be a massive judgment against those people. And that judgment, again, is going to be about death and about going into the earth, into the grave. And literally, they're going to be sucked into the grave. The chapter closes with this interesting idea about the tzitzit on the corner of the garments. Most people are kind of familiar with this idea that on the fringes of a person's garment or his robe or his clothes, especially a Jewish person, they would have these little tassels on them. And the idea was like the rabbis had it. And so when Jesus was walking and the woman who was bleeding for 12 years touched just the little tassel, that's what it says, she was just wanting to touch the little fringe, the little part of it that was hanging off of there. That's how she was healed. And so you understand that for like the rabbis and the prominent people. But the idea here was that now everybody was supposed to have this on their garments. And the reason why is to remember the commandments of the Lord, to do them and to not go spying out after their own hearts, their own eyes, prostituting themselves. And there's another reference to prostitution and what they were doing, going after their own hearts, the sin that they committed in the land as they were spying out. There's another confirmation of that. That's actually the original verse I was looking for earlier. And so, yeah, it's at the end of chapter 15. And so God is going back to that idea and he's giving them this new thing to do with their clothes so that they can have a physical reminder of the commandments of God in thread. And so that is going to be on the edge of their clothes. And so there's going to be something there that's hanging. And then there's a whole thing about how many laws, like 613 laws, and then the number of the word. There's like numbers you assign to the letters of tzitzit, and then it comes out to 613. I don't know. All that stuff is interesting, but ultimately what it really refers to is the idea that the people are going to have now a daily reminder on their clothes. It's going to be required to have these, like I said, they're like tassels hanging off their clothes, a certain color. There's like blue, purple, some kind of argument is given about exactly the color there, but that's to remind them of God's commandments and so that they keep them. So when they pray, they hold them and they remind them God's commandments and all that kind of stuff, which obviously is something they need. They need a reminder. Now, we already looked at Joshua chapter 2. What I wanted to point out, I think in connection with the tzitzit, was this scarlet thread. Remember, Rahab said, "Give me a sign so it can protect my family," and they told her to hang a scarlet thread outside of their outside of their window, because she lived in the wall, so that they would know not to go and kill those people when they came to attack her and her family. And the whole scarlet thread thing here, verse 18, that unless you tie this line of scarlet thread in the window, which you have lowered us down and gathered yourself, like we're not going to be held accountable. That's just the deal there they make with Rahab. But what I was thinking was, maybe that's the idea of the tzitzit, right? The idea of that thread hanging there to remember the commandments, to remember the promises. And so it's just a sign. It's a sign of Rahab and her family, like they're going to obey God's commandment, or at least they're dedicating themselves to that. And so having that sign there for them is going to save them. Alrighty, so let's close out with our New Testament portion. We have from Hebrews chapter 3. I know there's a lot there could be said about Rahab that I didn't really go into, about her faithfulness and obedience, but I think we can get some of that in here with this discussion in the book of Hebrews. So what we have here is the writer of Hebrews is building up his case as to why Jesus is greater than anything anyone ever has seen. He starts off with greater than angels, and then he gets into greater than Moses. And the opening of this chapter, he explains that while Moses built the house of God and was faithful to God's house, it is the Messiah, the Son, who's in charge of the house, and that we are the house. We're the house because the house is a house of faith. Those who are believing in God and believing in his teachings. And so we are the living stones and we are the temple. And so that's just what he's saying there. And so as he gives that comparison, again, the writer of Hebrews is starting with wanting to establish Jesus's prominence and preeminence in the history of the Jewish people, because to his audience, they are Messianic Jewish believers. That's why the book is called Hebrews. And so he wants them to, again, just understand how great Jesus is, how great Yeshua is in light of all of their history and their past. And so he gets to that point with Moses, because he's the kind of the final person to compare him to. And then he gets into the core of his message, which is about the dangers of apostasy, or the dangers of falling away. And so he quotes from Psalm 95, which he says the Spirit of God is the one who's speaking. There in verse 7, Psalm 95 says this, is today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness. And what I learned just in studying is that there's like a famous like Jewish proverb type of story kind of thing that's out there, where this guy is like, oh, tomorrow I'll repent, tomorrow I'll turn back to the covenant of God. And a rabbi is like, well, what if you don't have tomorrow? If you don't have tomorrow, then you have to do this today. So today is the day. And so they use that Psalm 95 and that concept, like today, if you hear his voice, if you hear God call you to repentance, or just calling you in general, respond to it today. Don't say, okay, wow, God's calling to me. You know what? I'm going to deal with it tomorrow. Let me say something. I've done it in my own life, or go to church on a Sunday, or hear a random message on a Wednesday, or I'm praying on a Friday night, and I get this conviction, and it comes from God. It comes from his Spirit. I'm like, man, you know what? Tomorrow, when I wake up, I'm going to get my Bible out. I'm going to read. I'm going to study. I'm going to pray. I'm going to really connect with God. And more often than not, when tomorrow comes, tomorrow's problems come with it. And so today really is important. So if I'm having that conviction, even if you're listening to this right now and you're hearing this, like, man, turn this off. I could care less if you listen all the way through or everything I say. Like, I really just want people to grow. And so if God is speaking to you right now and he says, I want some quiet time with you, I want you to pull open your Bible, I want you to just pray, meditate, I want you to worship, then do that in obedience, right? That's what this concept is of today. If you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. And the example is, as those in the days of rebellion, and it's what we just been reading in the book of Numbers, where the fathers put them to test, and they saw his works for 40 years, and they tested him, and they tested him, and they tested him, and they tested him, and they continued to go astray. They didn't know his ways, and so they did not enter his rest. And so that's, he quotes that from Psalms, and this is where he goes into the teaching. In verse 12, take care, brothers and sisters, that none of you has an evil heart of unbelief that falls away from the living God. And remember, an evil heart of unbelief, That's not about like, oh, I had just the wrong information. I'm not sure, or like doubting. Not really. It's about what's replacing the belief that you should have in God. And that's where he's warning the people about unbelief, but not just any unbelief, an evil heart in unbelief. And so for those people in Numbers, their evil heart was, these gods are the gods that I know and I'm familiar with, and I want to be with them. And so while God says I should trust in him, and he's shown me all the ways and all of his power and all of his glory, I've seen it all, and I know the consequences are there too. I'm choosing to not believe that because I'm going to put my faith in someone else or something else, or even in myself. And that's what it comes down to. He says in verse 13, but encourage one another day by day, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And so this tells us that, again, on a practical basis, on an everyday basis, it is our responsibility to hear our God and to respond to his call every day that we're alive. There really shouldn't be a day that we go by and we haven't heard our God speak out to us, because he is. And so we need to be paying attention, and we need to be focused and understanding how God speaks. And I know God will speak through the study of scripture, but he can speak in so many other ways as well. It could be a song on the radio. It could be a message like this one you're hearing, a podcast you're listening to. It could be a sermon on a Sunday. It could be a hymn that you're worshiping with, or just a worship song in general. It could be through a dream. It can be any way that God speaks, but are you listening? It could be through the mouth of a child. My daughter could say something and I'm like, oh, wow, I think God is speaking through you right now. Like, what? Yeah, I think God is speaking through you right now. It can be through your spouse. And it can be those things where normally you kind of go into a fight about it because you're like, oh, why'd you say that? It's rude. But maybe God was speaking through your spouse or through your kid in a way where he's trying to get to you and point out something in your life that needs to change. Don't discount those criticisms or even the remarks that we get from our loved ones, because a lot of times, they notice stuff about us and they have the courage to say those things about us, while they have that courage, as long as we don't shut them down, that can be where God is speaking through somebody to try to get to us. So don't ignore it. While it's today, pay attention. And in verse 14, why? Because we've become partners with the Messiah, and we have to hold on to our conviction until the end if we're going to keep that partnership with him, our original conviction. And that is that he is the Messiah. So for his audience, they may be getting led astray or being pulled away from the faith that is in the Messiah because people are telling them, hey, listen, you're forgetting Moses, how great Moses is and his teachings, and you have to follow and obey Moses. Remember how great of a man Moses was? And Moses really was a great man. He was a faithful guy. We can see that. We've been studying that. But ultimately, once Jesus shows up, once Yeshua comes, the Messiah comes, Moses, he matters, but not the same way. Now we stay faithful to the commandments of the Messiah, the commandments of Yeshua. He is the one who gains preeminence. He is the one who is seated at the right hand of God. He is the exact representation of God himself. That's how the book of Hebrews opens. And then he reminds us again, like, who are the ones who rebelled? It was the ones who provoked God for 40 years, and it was those who sinned and their bodies fell in the wilderness, and those are the ones who are disobedient. And so the writer of Hebrews says, so don't be like them. They weren't able to enter into the rest of God, the promised land of God, because of their evil heart and their disobedience. And so you don't want to fall into the same kind of trap. And so for the people at his time, the writer of Hebrews is saying, if you originally understand Messiah to be Yeshua and faith through him and faith to God through him and all that entails, then stick with that. Because if you don't, if you rebel, then you won't enter into the rest that God has promised you through Messiah. Because in essence, what you're doing is rejecting the faith that comes through Messiah, or at least that original conviction. So it's possible not to lose your salvation, but to deny it and to throw it away, to choose to follow another path. That's what the example that's given to us in Numbers is supposed to highlight for us. Those people were still saved. They were saved out of Egypt, but then they died in the wilderness. Or what did their life amount to? The promise that they were promised to enter into the rest, to have the land flowing with milk and honey, they never got. They never got to rest. They wandered and wandered and wandered. And I don't know exactly how that applies for us today, but I know what the writer of Hebrews is saying is if we don't hold on to our original conviction about who Jesus is, we start to bring in other aspects to enhance our faith, to understand our faith, or at least we go away from our faith that Jesus has given us, we have in him, the faith that he's authored and perfected, a phrase that also comes from the book of Hebrews, then yeah, we're in danger of not entering into the rest that God has promised us as we wander through this wilderness in this particular time. So that's the warning the writer of Hebrews gives. And it's a warning I have as well for myself and for you. Like, we have to know the faith that Jesus has given us, and we have to, just hold on to that original conviction, because there are going to be temptations. We may not be tempted to go back to the law and circumcise ourselves and all this other stuff that was going on at that time. We may not have that, but there are other temptations, other laws, other rules, other rituals that are even within the denominations of so-called Christianity that we might go and follow, thinking that's a better way than just what Jesus has authored and perfected for us to follow. And so we have to be careful with that. All right, so that closes this week's teaching. I pray that it truly is an encouragement to you this week. It's also an exhortation for you to remember to stay on the path that has been designed and given by the Father and has then been opened up as a way for us to walk on this earth by the work of the Lord Jesus. Ultimately, that's our original conviction, that faith in Yeshua, faith in Jesus will lead us to the Father, that we have to enter by him, that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him, and that as we walk that way, we recognize the signposts that tell us that we are remaining faithful to the way. And that's kind of my overall goal in my ministry, is to help people understand there's so many ways to diverge from the path, and ultimately they will lead to destruction. And so we have to be, just adamant about being focused on what is right and what is true and what is noble and what is perfect and what is good, and just keeping our eyes on the one who authored and perfected our faith, following the path that he set for us, and the end game, the end goal, where he is in that rest. That's where we want to enter, right? In his presence, in the presence of our Father in heaven. So again, I pray this is always an encouragement to you. If you think this was helpful, I just pray that you would that you would subscribe. If you have any comments, please share that below. Anything to help, open up discussion, or maybe there's a disagreement that you have, a legitimate concern. Please share that with me, because I would also like to grow by your interaction. So thank you again for watching. God bless.